Okay, I want to take advantage of tonight to chazer over and maybe expand a little bit on the yisodos that we spoke about by the Nilas HaChag, which were Nageya to Parshas Ba'aloischa, and to give a little bit more clarity to those in Yanim. In the atmosphere of a Nilas HaChag, you speak one way, and when you're giving a shir, you speak a different way, and hopefully we could add some clarity. And Ramesha, you were there, so whatever you get now will just be added to that. Yeah. No, a lot of people here were there, but Baruch Hashem, it's good to chazer. I spent a lot of time today chazering it over myself, and it was very kedai. So Parshas Ba'aloischa records finally, after all these months, and for us all these weeks, that Klal Yisrael finally traveled away from Har Sinai, and they started on the next leg of their journey through the Masa'os, the Al Pi Hashem Yachanu, Al Pi Hashem Yiso, like it says in this week's parsha, that it became time to leave, and they had been at Har Sinai for almost a year, I believe, comes out, and it was time for them to leave. And it says, "Vayisu mehar Hashem derech shloishes yamim va'aroim bris Hashem noiseya lifneihem derech shloishes yamim lasur lohem menucha." Now this inyan of Vayisu mehar Hashem is recorded in Moshe Rabbeinu's Teichacha in Parshas Devarim. When Moshe Rabbeinu is giving Teichacha to Klal Yisrael, everything that it says in Parshas Devarim is part of a seder of Teichacha. It's not just and not just Devarim. A lot of Chumash, most of Chumash Devarim, is not just repeating what happened, but it's doing it in a manner. It's said differently, because it's said in a manner to teach lessons to Klal Yisrael, to give Teichacha, to give Musar, to try to correct possible distortions or pitfalls in the path of Klal Yisrael. So Moshe Rabbeinu would review things that happened over the 40 years and try to frame them in a way that could form as a chizuk for Klal Yisrael moving forward. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael that the time came for us to leave, and it's the lashon of the pasuk is Perek Aleph Pasuk Yutes is Vanisa Mechayrev, that we traveled away from Har Sinai. Vanelech es Kol Hamidbar Agadol Va'anoira Hahu. The Mefarshim ask why it's necessary to say that we traveled from Chayrev. It already said that Hashem told them to travel. If it would have said Vanelech es Kol Hamidbar Agadol Hahu, it would have been very clear that they traveled away from Har Sinai. Why is it important to say Vanisa Mechayrev? That's one question. The other question is, which is an unbelievably fascinating question. This is the type of thing that you once you notice this, you can never unnotice it. And that is that in the very beginning of the parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us it's time to leave Har Sinai. Perek Aleph Pasuk Zayin Pinu Use'u Lachem. It's time for you to go. It's time to travel. And from Pasuk Zayin till Pasuk Yutes, where it says that they actually traveled, Moshe Rabbeinu says words that are very, very famous. In fact, he says words that we say in Echatrap. Echo eso levadi. Moshe Rabbeinu says, how could I carry alone Klal Yisrael? And he says, I have to appoint other dayanim. I can't do it alone. I have to appoint dayanim and shoftim and put them in charge of you. And he describes what we call the minoi hadayanim, the appointing of dayanim and shoftim over Klal Yisrael. Now, this is a very important thing, that there was a judicial system that worked in an organized manner, Sarei Alafim, Sarei Meyos, that there was an organized judicial system. That's a very significant, important thing. But what's so unbelievable is that Moshe Rabbeinu decides to repeat that parsha between saying that he told us to leave Har Sinai and saying that we actually left Har Sinai. Why is it so unbelievable? Because we left Har Sinai in the second year after coming out of Mitzrayim. When did the Klal Yisrael appoint judges? So the parsha of the Minui of Dayanim is in the beginning of Parshas Yisro. Right? This was all Yisro's idea. Right? So it was in the beginning of Parshas Yisro. But actually did not take place then. Rashi and the Ramban both say that when it says in the beginning of Parshas Yisro, Vayihi mi macharos, it was the next day, Didn't mean the next day after Yisro arrived. It meant the next day after all the events of Ma'amad Har Sinai. Says Rashi and the Ramban in the name of the Mechilta that the Parsha of Yisro was said Mimachras Yom HaKippurim. It was said after Moshe Rabbeinu finally came down from the mountain for the third time. So finally, it was said that the parsha of Yisro. Okay, so that's what Rashi and the Ramban learn. So you have to ask yourself. That means that months before, that when they started to build the Mishkan, before the day they started to gather the materials for the Mishkan, that was a very busy day. Moshe Rabbeinu had this conversation with Yisro, and they spoke about setting up Dayanim. Why is it necessary at this point in time, when Moshe Rabbeinu is saying the narrative of leaving Har Sinai, why is it necessary then to say that Klal Yisrael set up that there was this thing of setting up Dayanim, of setting up judges? Now, the truth is that the Aderes Eliyahu, which is the Gra, he holds that it actually happened here. And there's a little bit of a smach for that, because a few psukim before, Moshe Rabbeinu actually says to Yisro, you see a conversation with Yisro, Noisem anachnu, we're leaving. It's very probable that Yisro then said, before I leave, because Yisro, it's a little bit of a shaila if Yisro ended up going along with them or not. But the Pashtas, Yisro said, I'm going to leave. I'm going back to my own country. The Pashtas that Yisro said, I'm going back to my own country. So at that time, it could be, it's reasonable. The Yisro said, by the way, I just see that you're not surviving here, and you need to set up a system of judges. So according to the Gra, there was a system of judges that was actually set up at this time. But ha gufa kasha. Still, why was this the appropriate time? Why, when they left Har Sinai, either why is it a time to remember about it, or why is it the time to do it? But why is this the time? So either it happened the day after Yom Kippur, and we're mentioning it now, or it happened now. So I want to say like this. Let's chazer. We actually learned this. I don't remember if we did it this year or last year, but we actually learned this about the idea of what Yisro was mechadesh when he showed up and he taught Klal Yisrael, taught Moshe Rabbeinu this idea that Moshe Rabbeinu then checked with Hashem, this idea of setting up judges. But I want to talk about it for a minute because it's very interesting. Here you have the man's name was Yisro. He had 7 names, the Torah tells us, and one of them is Yeser, because the Parsha was added to the Torah because of him. Because the Parsha of the Dayanim, it means this Parsha of the Dayanim, was added to the Torah because of him. So B'meila, it's called, that's why it's Yeser. Now when Yisro came from the outside, and he added a Parsha to the Torah, that's a phenomenal thing. The Torah is supposed to be a whole thing, it's a whole system. Someone comes from the outside and says something, and we're like, and it gets added on to the Torah. How do we understand that? Not just that, the lashon that Yisro says to Moshe is Tzei himalech v'gevura. Go out and ask Hashem. Interesting lashon. He said, go out and ask Hashem. What do you mean go out? You're not going out when you ask Hashem. What does that lashon mean? So many, many years ago, my Rosh Yeshiva explained the following very, very, very deep and important concept about the Torah. The Torah is perfect. And part of the perfection of the Torah is that there's a way for imperfect people to connect with the Torah. That's also part of its perfection. And that the practical way that a physical nation can connect to this incredible, mind-boggling, massive, perfect Torah, that's also part of the Torah. The Torah, so to speak, comes with a handle. It comes with a way to hold it. It comes with a way to approach it. And that is represented by what Yisro's conversation with Moshe Rabbeinu, that Yisro tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you're teaching the Torah, but it's not practical. Right? That's really what he said. It's not practical. Novoil tiboil. You're going to fall apart. You can't sustain this. It's not practical. Meaning the ideas are incredible. What you want to do is profound. But because of the limitations of a physical nation and of physical people, it can't be implemented this way, the way you're doing it. We need a different plan. And that plan is to break it down into different dayanim. The idea that Moshe Rabbeinu himself won't be teaching every single person was unfathomable to them. Moshe is the Noisei HaTorah. They couldn't imagine it. Because in the pristine sense of the Torah being given, Moshe Rabbeinu was the teacher of Torah, the Yidden were the students of Torah, and the goal was that those two should meet, and Moshe should teach Torah to Klal Yisrael, or tell them what the halacha is, or paskin their shaylas, or deal with their din Torahs directly to Moshe Rabbeinu. That was in theory, in a pristine sense, that was the way it needed to be. But in this world, we have to also live with the limitations of our humanity. And the Torah addresses that as well. The Torah doesn't just dump itself on you and you have to figure it out. The Torah addresses that as well. And that comes from a Yisroi who comes from the outside. It's very meaningful that he comes from the outside because he has a perspective of the outside, not the Pneumius. He has a perspective of the more external, practical part of it. You can imagine that when you're involved in something, someone could come and be like, yeah, but you're not in the right building. Like, you never thought of that. Because sometimes you need someone who's not involved in all the pneumius of what's happening to get a sense of like how this external structure could work. Okay? Now, and that's the lashon that Yisro tells Moshe, Tzei himalech v'gevura. Go out. Go out of your internal pneumius understanding of it and consult with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzei, go out. Go out of that internal world and himalech v'gevura. So that is what the parsha of Yisro represents. It represents this idea that the Torah is accessible even to us in this world with our limitations, and that the Torah itself provides a bridge to that. That's what the parsha of Yisro represents. Okay? That's Aleph. Very important to know. Now, Beis, what we have to realize is that when Klal Yisrael left Har Sinai, the pasuk tells us, Vayisu, in this week's parsha, Parshas Ba'aloischa, the pasuk tells us, Vayisu me'har Hashem. They traveled away from the mountain of Hashem. The Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos Daf Kuf Tei Zayin that they traveled away from Hashem. They traveled away from Hashem. That's why it says Mehar Hashem. The Mefarshim point out that it always calls it Hara Elokim. Over here it calls it Hara Hashem. They traveled away from Hashem. What is that referring to? So the Ramban on these psukim and Tosfos and Masechta Shabbos are mazkir. They mention the Medrash, that the Medrash says something about Klal Yisrael. It says that there was a Chazal say that there was a Puranos. There was. Let me say where this is coming from. Part of the story of Klal Yisrael traveling in this week's parsha is that we're zeiche to the pasuk of Vayihi b'tzayah ha'aroin vayomer Moshe. And when I say we're zeiche to the pasuk of Vayihi b'tzayah ha'aroin that we say when we take out the Sefer Torah, when we say we're zeiche to that pasuk, I mean that we're zeiche to it because it's not where it belongs. It's, if you look at a Sefer Torah, it has two nuns. It has nunim hafuchim, backwards nuns, like putting it in brackets, separating it. And the Gemara says in that sugya in Shabbos, in Parakol Kisvei, the Gemara says, Ein ze mekoymai. Isn't that amazing? This is not where the parsha of Vayihi b'tzayah ha'aroin belongs. It belongs somewhere else. And it's written here, lahafsik bein puranos lepuranos. It's written here to separate between one catastrophe and the other. And the Ramban says there are 3 catastrophes in a row that are written in the Psukim. And he says the first one is Vayisu Mehar Hashem. What's the catastrophe? What happened? What's the Pur'anus? The Pur'anus, says the Ramban, is that the Medrash says that they traveled away from Har Sinai, Ketinoik haboireach mi beis hasefer. They traveled away like a child running away from school. That's how it describes them leaving Har Sinai. And the Ramban says that it means they traveled away b'simcha, with joy. And he says an unbelievable thing. He says they were afraid that if they stayed by the mountain, Hashem would give them more mitzvahs. So they wanted to get out of there before there was the 614th mitzvah. That's what the Ramban says. Now, the Chassam Sofer in his drushes says, isn't that interesting that it calls that a Pur'anus? Pur'anus, you know where the word Pur'anus comes from? The word Pur'anus comes from Peireya, because it's an Einish. It's Hashem pays us. We shouldn't lay aleinu when Klal Yisrael does something wrong. A Pur'anus comes. Hashem is Peireya. Hashem pays. It is an Einish. That's a Pur'anus. He says running away from Har Sinai is not a Pur'anus. It's an Aveira. The other Pur'aniyas that are mentioned have Aveiras attached to them too, but they have also the Einish. The Asafsuf, the different things that are mentioned, that there is Einshim attached. Over here, it doesn't say any Einish. Loimotzinu, we do not find. It's an amazing thing. Klal Yisrael left Har Sinai. They left Har Sinai like children. And what happened to them? Nothing. Chassam Sofer's kasha. I wouldn't be able to guarantee nothing happened to them, but the Chassam Sofer says nothing happened to them. That's a Pur'anus? What's the Pur'anus? So this really left me thinking, this Chassam Sofer. He says a whole mahalach, but it really left me thinking. And I want to tell you what I came up with, which I think is an emes here in understanding this sugya. Okay, let's think a little bit. Let's be misbaining a little bit. In a deeper sense, why do children run away from school? So I want to say, in a deeper sense, that when Chazal talk about it, I'm not sitting here to diagnose a generation with ADD. When Chazal describe that children run away mi beis hasefer, it's a description of Chazal. The pshat is like this: children don't have das. Right? They don't have that maturity of das. That's why they're not obligated in mitzvahs. Children don't have das. Beis hasefer is a place where we're trying to pour das on them. Right? We're trying to give them knowledge and seichel. They're not sichliistic people. And we're trying to pour seichel, das, on them. That's not natural for them. That's not who they are. And there's a resistance to it. Of course, we have to do it to try to be margil them and being balei das. We try to teach them in a beis hasefer, but when we're done, they're bayreach, because they're not naturally balei das. What does that mean? That means they don't naturally, at that age, have the kalim, the vessels, with which to hold all of that das, and to integrate it, and to absorb it in a way that makes it enjoyable and wonderful to sit there. When an adult listens to words of das, and he feels motivated, and he's not boireach, and he doesn't run away, it's because he feels like he has the ability and the kalim to integrate that and to receive it, and it's not pushing him out of his comfort zone. He's leaning into it, because he's a bardas, so he's like a sponge. He absorbs das. But someone who doesn't have das, you could have adults that don't have das also. They also bareich mi beis hasefer, But someone who with children that don't have das, they don't have the kalim to be able to absorb that. It's very difficult. Okay, that's part of our job, to try to be margil them in it. So they should have the habits of learning Torah. But that's the concept of tinoik habareich mi beis hasefer. And I want to say a chiddush here, and that is as follows. As we've learned so many times in our understanding of these parshiyas, when Klal Yisrael did the Egel, something shifted in them. It wasn't just they did an Aveira. As we learned that Klal Yisrael, before they did the Egel, when they were in the world of the Luchais Rishonais, the first Luchais, They were in the world of Paska Zu Hamasa. They were in the world of that they had returned to the Madrega of Adam Arishon Kaidem Achet. They were in another place. Their bodies and their neshamas were ready to fuse together like Adam Arishon before the Chet. That's what the Gemara says. The best model of it that I always think back to is that the luchais are representative of the Yid learning Torah. You have the rock, that's like the body, and then you have the engraved words, that's the seichel that's being imprinted on it. The first luchais, where did the rocks come from? They came from Hashem. Hashem supplied the rock. That represents even bodies that were rooted in spirituality. Even bodies that were ready for Aliyah. That's like Adam Rishon Kaidem Achet. The second luchais, where did the rocks come from? Psalicha. By Hashem, Moshe was told, carve out those rocks. They came from the ground. Because after the Chet, our bodies had fallen back. And we were now in a place where that struggle of that das to take hold that we live in today, that we could forget. They say that there was no shikha in the Luchais Rishonos, that we would have never forgotten Torah. Shikha is only in the Luchais Shniyos. Because what does it mean to forget? It means it's not permanently imprinted. Dr. Shir, you remember the old faxes that used to get, like, after a while you couldn't read them anymore? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
You remember?
Yeah.
So, like, our minds are a little like that. We forget. But that means because it's not imprinted properly. Because our gufim are not those holy spiritual gufim that existed by the Luchais Rishonos before the Chet Egel. Our gufim are more compromised. And we quoted a few weeks ago in Parshas Bamidbar a lashon of a Chazal, that Chazal say that after the Luchais were broken, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Shibartem Naaseh, Hizoharu B'nishma. You said Nasa v'nishma by Har Sinai. We will do and we will hear. You broke Nasa. You broke, we will do. You violated the Torah. At least keep nishma. Keep learning Torah. When we're in a matzav where Nasa is broken and we're trying to be Zohir b'nishma, we are in a very compromised state. Because our kelim, to be makabel, all of that nishma, all of that das, is compromised. That's why we needed a mishkan. That's why when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai, the day after Yom Kippur, they needed a mishkan. We needed more kelim to carry the Ashuras HaShechina. Something had broken in us. There was a psul, there was a chet that compromised our gufim. Even though it says v'shachanti b'soicham in them, as we mentioned last week, but there was still. It needed help. We needed a mishkan. I want to tell you that I think that the Pur'anus of Tinak HaBerech Mibeis HaSefer is because it was a side effect of the Chet HaEgel. As a side effect of the Chet HaEgel, Klal Yisrael was standing around Har Sinai worried that more das might come down. And they were worried that we don't have the ability to connect to all that das. We don't have the ability. It's too much. You know the feeling? You know that feeling when you're hearing a shir? I have it sometimes. The person says the first step. Like, okay, I got it. The second step. Yeah, I got it. The third step. Now you're starting to hold on for dear life. Then there's a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. At a certain point, just like, okay, I give up. I can't anymore. Right? It just piled too high. What does that mean? That means that your kalim couldn't handle all the das. Right? That's what it means. You can handle the first level. You can handle the second level. You can handle the third level, but your kalim couldn't handle the whole thing. I think when Klal Yisrael was standing by Har Sinai, they were afraid that they weren't prepared. They weren't mukhan to be able to handle all of it because they were compromised from the Chet HaEgel. That's why it's called a Pur'anus and not an Aveira. That's why they weren't punished for it. It's an effect of the Chet. And if I'm right about that, then it's unbelievably beautiful. First of all, let me explain. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu to tell Klal Yisrael in Parashas Devarim, Penu u'sa'u lachem, turn and travel. What does that mean? That means that when you're traveling, focus on your destination. When you say turn and travel, the concept is focus on where you're heading. That's why it says Vanisa me Chayrev, and we traveled away from Chayrev. Does it say we turned? No. You know why? Because they were Tinai Kaberech mi Beis HaSefer. They were more focused on where they were leaving than they were on where they were going. That was the chisaron. That's why by the plan it says Penu Usa'u Lachem. But by the execution of the plan, it just says Vanisa Mechayrev to show that it doesn't say Vanifen Vanisa Mechayrev. Because there was an element of Tinai Kaberech mi Beis HaSefer. But Hafle Vafela, Moshe Rabbeinu chooses to tell them the Parsha of Yisro as he's telling them that they left Har Sinai. And here's the Musar. The Musar is, you were afraid that you were going to get more mitzvahs. That's why you ran away from Har Sinai. Don't you remember the lesson of Yisro? Don't you remember that the Torah always supplies you with a way to connect? Don't you remember that there's always HaKadosh Baruch Hu will daiga, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will worry that you can connect to the Torah, that there's a path for you? You think Hashem forgot about you? You don't remember the Parsha of Minoi Hadayanim? According to the Gra, it actually happened here for that reason, to prepare them for this. But the idea was, you're having this feeling like, oh no, there's more das coming down on me? No. The Torah is perfect, and part of the Torah being perfect is that there's a way for every single Yid to find his place in Torah. That's part of Sein Chelkeinu B'Seirasecha. That's part of the perfection of the Torah, that there's a makom for each person. Pen Yirbe Aleinu Mitzvahs. Maybe Hashem will give us more mitzvahs. Don't you realize that Hashem gave us 248 mitzvahs aseh because they correspond to the Eivarim, to the organs in a person's body, and 365 mitzvahs leisaseh because they respond to the Gidim in a person's body? Don't you realize that there's a specific shidduch here between the Torah and the Jew and the Yid? You think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is just going to start dumping more mitzvahs that you have the kalim to carry, like children that are running away mi Beis HaSefer? Isn't that amazing? That's why Dafka here in Parshas Devarim, it says the sugya of Yisro at the point of Vanisa Mehar Hashem. And I'll go a step further, and I'll say that maybe that's why it actually happened, according to Rashi and the Ramban, the day after Yom Kippur. The day after Yom Kippur is where they picked up the pieces from the Chet HaEgel. It's where they started building the Mishkan. What does the building of the Mishkan mean? Shibartem Naaseh. We're limited now. We need a Mishkan. And we're limited now. We need Dayanim. That's part of the same Mahalach. They go together. That's Shibartem Naaseh, Izaharu Benishma. And I'll take it even a step further. And that is as follows. And maybe I'll end with this. Moshe Rabbeinu is the Rebbe. Klal Yisrael are the Talmidim. Moshe Rabbeinu, we know, is the das of Klal Yisrael. And Klal Yisrael are the guf. We're trying to receive that das. When I tell you that the sugya of the Binoi Hadayanim corresponds to Tina Kaberech mi Beis HaSefer, it's more literal than you think. This was about the ability of Moshe Rabbeinu, the das, to attach itself to the people. And the whole point of the Binoi Hadayanim was there is a way that the das can connect. There is a way that the das can connect. It's such an unbelievably exact parallel. So of course, at the time of Anisa Mehar Hashem is the time, according to Rashi and the Ramban, to give Musar about the Minoi Hadayanim, and according to the Gra, to actually do the Minoi Hadayanim, because this is the time to say, don't be a Tina Kaberech mi Beis HaSefer. Hashem has a place for you in the world of Torah. And this is something for us to know. A lot of times, we hesitate to consider ourselves to be Baalei Torah, B'nei Torah, Talmidei Chachamim, people engaged in Torah. We hesitate. We feel like, I don't know, I'll listen. We don't consider ourselves citizens, owners, balabatim of the world of Torah. And there's this sense, this fear of Tina Kaberech mi Beis HaSefer, which now we can be much more sympathetic. to the Tinek HaBerech Mi Beis Sefer. It's going to be too much. I don't want to take achrayas for being a Talmud Chacham. It's too much for me. And the story of Anisa Mehar Hashem, the Puranus of Anisa Mehar Hashem, and the Musar that Moshe Rabbeinu gave Klal Yisrael about the Vanisa Mehar Hashem, is that part of our emunah in Hashem and part of our emunah in the Torah is that there's a makayim for every yid in the Torah, and that nobody is excluded. And it's saying Chelkeinu b'Sarasechas, each individual yid has his makayim in Torah, has his place, and that means that you have a chelik of Torah. What is it? Something to think about. I have to own that. I have to take our responsibility. I have to take what's mine, because there's a path, just like the Minoi Hadayanim teaches that to be, just like the Musar of Tinuk HaBerech Mi Beis HaSefer. We have to remember that this is ours, this is mine. You know, the Maral points out that Moshe Rabbeinu, the pasuk says, "V'zois HaTorah asher sam Moshe l'fnei b'nei Yisrael." The lashon of some Moshe l'fnei b'nei Yisrael, Moshe places in front of Klal Yisrael. This is yours. Don't be a guest. You own this. This is yours. The Torah is mine. Look around at the Svarim. Look around at Shas and Paiskim. Look around at Chumash and Tanakh. Look around and say, this is mine. I have rights to this. This is my Torah. There's no doors that are closed to me. There's a path. There's a way for me to become familiar with the Torah and to own the Torah. There's a path for me. This is mine. This is mine. Don't let other people make it as if the Torah is theirs. I always tie it, I said this years ago, that's the message of Hagbah. We pick up the Sefer Torah and we show it to the people. What's the idea? The idea is, in that sense, the Baal Koreh who's reading the Torah, he's the Rebbe. And everyone else is the Talmidim. And then the Rebbe picks up the Torah and says, I'm not the Rebbe. You're also the Rebbe. Here, the same Torah applies to everybody. Everyone has the Torah. We very, 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 very machshav our Rabbeim. We need Rabbeim. But there's nothing that a Rebbe does that I can't lift myself up to do. I own the same Torah he does. In fact, I could even fight with my Rebbe in learning, as exists all over Shas. And I could even have my own pshat, because I have an ownership. I have an ownership. I have a stake. I'm an owner of the Torah. So that's the message. That's how we stand against Tinuk HaBerech Mi Beis HaSefer, is that we trust that we have a place in the world of Torah. Yashikayach.